My mother-in-law demands that my husband provide for her and his sister, and I have a difficult situation in my life. My mother-in-law insists that my husband should support her. In addition, she threatens to take away our children from me. This situation causes me a lot of anxiety and worry. How can I deal with this pressure? What steps should I take to protect myself and my children? My name is Michelle. I was born and raised in a small town in the Midwest of America. I have two older sisters, Caroline and Jessica. We have always been very close to each other, even though we each have our own personalities. My mom raised us alone after my dad left the family when I was very young. She kept a small store, and her love and care helped us all grow up to be strong women. I was always a quiet child, preferring noisy companies to stay at home. Since childhood, I loved to draw and dreamed of one day becoming an artist. But life arranged otherwise. After high school, I went to college and chose the specialty marketing because I like to come up with ideas for advertising and understand how brands work. Besides, my mom always said that you should choose a profession that will feed you and provide a stable income. After college, I got a job at a small advertising company as a project manager. I loved the job. I was responsible for coordinating teams, monitoring deadlines, and communicating with clients. In the office, I quickly gained a reputation as a responsible and attentive employee. But despite my success at work, my personal life left much to be desired. I rented a small apartment not far from work and moved in. Caroline married first, shortly after graduating from university. Her husband was a successful lawyer, and they moved to New York. A couple years later, Jessica found love and moved to Chicago with her banker husband. And I stayed living in our town with my mom. Sometimes I thought I just didn't know how to attract men's attention. Besides, I didn't have much time for a personal life. All my time was taken up with work. Every time I tried to make new acquaintances, everything went wrong. Sometimes it even seemed to me that I was doing something wrong, that there was some flaw in me that was pushing people away. After another failed date, I came home frustrated and tired. Sitting on the couch, I stared out the window, thinking about how I may never be destined to meet someone special. In these moments, I felt the loneliness very keenly. I always knew that my mom was a person who just didn't know how to sit idle. Her energy seemed endless. She was always organizing, planning, and of course, interfering in my life, especially in the part of my personal life. My older sisters were married long ago, with families and children. I, being the only unmarried daughter, turned into a real headache for my mother. Every visit to my home began the same way. As soon as I crossed the threshold, I heard the familiar question, "Well, how is your personal life? Is there someone?" I always answered the same thing. "No, Mom, no one yet." And each time, a look of disappointment would appear on her face. Mom would sigh, shake her head, and repeat her eternal, "Oh, my daughter, why are things so difficult for you?" Then followed the invariable advice, "Maybe you should try to get acquainted on the internet? Everyone finds their soulmate there nowadays." Sometimes I thought it would be easier for her if I brought someone home, as long as they were male and ready to marry. But I persisted in my own life, hoping that one day Mom would realize that happiness can't be found on a schedule or under pressure. But instead of accepting my attempts at privacy, my mom decided to take matters into her own hands. She started inviting me home for get-togethers with her friends and acquaintances and her sons. I remember going to her house one day, and there was some guy sitting there who was apparently the son of one of her friends. He was cute but totally not my type. I tried to make conversation, but all I could think about was, how am I going to get out of here? It went on like that for months. Every time I went to my mom's house, she had already prepared me in advance to meet the next suitor. I felt like I was on some weird reality show where I was being put on display. It was becoming unbearable. I was annoyed by the constant interference, the feeling that my life didn't belong to me. Eventually, I just stopped visiting her. I needed time or I wouldn't be able to take the pressure. But one day when I was at work, my coworkers talked me into going to a club. I wasn't in the mood, but they insisted, and I begrudgingly agreed. The club was chaotic, with loud music blaring, lights flashing, and a crowd of people moving to the beat. I was just trying to relax, ordering a couple of cocktails. At one point, a young man approached me. We exchanged a few meaningless phrases. I didn't even remember his name. He was cute, but at that moment I was too relaxed to pay much attention to him. So I forgot about him. A month passed and I went to my friend's engagement party. I was in high spirits, enjoying the party atmosphere, when suddenly a guy approached me. He looked like he was waiting for me to recognize him. When he saw that I didn't react in any way, he introduced himself and reminded me that we had met before. I was very surprised and couldn't remember him. His confidence and calmness amazed me, because that night at the club I was so immersed in my own thoughts that I paid little attention to others. We started talking, and he turned out to be quite an interesting person to talk to. His name was Tom, and he worked as a manager in a company. He shared his ambitious career plans. At first, I wasn't that interested, but his openness and ability to listen bought me over. Soon he started calling frequently, inviting me to meetings, and although I wasn't particularly enthusiastic, his persistence impressed me. Mom, of course, also approved of our relationship. "He's a good man, he has a job, and he cares about you," she repeated. Eventually, I gave in. We started dating, and to my surprise, I became quite comfortable with him. He had a close relationship with his mother and his sister, who was my age. He often talked about how important it was for him to take care of his family. I found it touching, although I couldn't understand why his sister depended on them. Our conversations became more and more serious, and gradually I realized that he really valued family values and wanted to build a strong family. 2 years later, he proposed to me and I accepted. At that time, I had already become attached to him and saw him as a reliable partner, ready to build a future together. The first 2 years of our life together were wonderful. We traveled a lot, laughed until tears, spent time with friends. But in the third year, everything changed. We became parents. We had twins, a boy and a girl. It was an incredible event that filled our lives with joy and new worries. However, as it turned out, not everything was so simple. When the children were still very young, I began to notice changes in my husband's behavior. He began to stay late at work, and the money he earned was gradually decreasing. I didn't understand what was happening. At first, I thought it was just temporary difficulties at work, but then I noticed that he became more withdrawn and aloof. He used to share his worries with me, but now he avoided talking to me. I tried to talk to him about it, but he dismissed it every time, saying that everything was fine. "Just tired," he kept saying. But I sensed that there was more to it than that. It was becoming obvious that a rift was growing between us. I tried to figure out exactly what was going on, but my husband remained closed off and it made me anxious. I sat on the couch trying to get my thoughts together. The kids were sleeping peacefully and the room was filled with silence, but a real storm was raging inside me. I couldn't start a conversation with my husband. Every time I tried to bring up issues of concern, he would either shut up or rather rudely reply, "None of your business." Meanwhile, the financial situation was getting more and more strained. The money was literally melting away before my eyes, and every time I looked at the bills, I felt panic. It felt like the ground was slipping from under my feet. One evening, when I was once again drowning in numbers and calculations, the phone rang. It was my mother-in-law. The feelings this conversation evoked can be described in one word: shock. "Why doesn't my son send me money?" "It is you who forbid him. We have nothing to live on," sounded a demanding voice into the phone. I was overwhelmed by a wave of anger and incomprehension. Instead of the expected support, I faced accusations. My mother-in-law obviously thought that I was to blame for the situation. "How can you even spend his money if you don't work?" I was shocked by her words. I tried to explain that he actually has a family, his children, but my mother-in-law did not want to hear anything. Her position was unshakable. "He is obliged to support her because he is her son. She gave birth to him." After that conversation, my patience finally ran out. I realized that I could no longer rely only on my husband. I had to take the initiative into my own hands. I went out to work to earn money, as there was practically no money from my husband. My mother, despite her age, offered to help and took care of the children while I worked. This made things much easier, but parental support could not solve all our problems. My husband and I had an increasingly strained relationship. He kept coming home late, and when he finally showed up, there was a heavy silence between us. The atmosphere in the house was getting darker and darker, and neither party was ready to take the first step towards reconciliation. I noticed that he began to drink. At first it was just a few sips in the evening, but soon it became a daily ritual. He would start sipping alcohol, I would put the kids to bed, and by the end of the evening his bottle would be empty. I tried not to make a scene. Maybe it was just a temporary phase and he needed a rest. But a sense of hopelessness was growing inside me. One day after a hard day, I came home and found him in his chair with a bottle in his hands. He was staring up at the ceiling as if he were trying to see something. I moved closer, figuring that maybe this was the moment when I finally get some explanation for what was happening to him. His gaze was blank, his face drained of color. He seemed to have lost interest in life, in us, in our children. I cautiously sat down next to him. My emotions were boiling inside me. Fear, frustration, anger. But I held them back, knowing that the most important thing right now was to hear him, to try to understand what had brought him to this state. Something's wrong, and I don't understand why you don't want to talk to me, I said, trying to speak calmly. I do enough for you and the kids, and you have no right to control me, he said, as if snapping out of it. Those words stunned me. This was not the man I knew. I wanted him to be my partner, not my enemy. I didn't know how I was going to handle this situation. Every day became a challenge. I lived with the expectation of change and the hope that he would return to normal after all. But everyday life became more tragic and I felt more and more alone. As time went on, the mounting tension became unbearable. I could no longer bear the situation we found ourselves in. This was not the man I had once married. Even the memories of the days when we laughed together, teased each other, and just enjoyed each other's company seemed distant and hazy. All of that was in the past. Now there was a man in front of me that I simply didn't recognize. I realized that things weren't going to get better as long as we continued to live like this. Every conversation with him ended in arguments and alienation, and his mother only exacerbated the conflict. I realized it was time to put a stop to it. I needed clarity and certainty. After one particularly rough week, one night when he came home drunk again, I couldn't keep quiet any longer. We bumped into each other in the kitchen, and tension literally hung in the air. We can't go on like this, I said, trying my hardest not to yell. His eyes remained blank. There was no emotion or understanding in them. There was silence between us, and I stood there, staring at his blank face. Finally, gathering all my resolve, I said, I can't take it anymore. Pack up and go to your mother. I don't know how you will do it, but I won't let you stay here any longer. For a moment his face changed, as if he had just realized the reality of his actions. What do you mean? He asked, trying to maintain a semblance of calm. I knew this decision wouldn't be easy, but at the same time it was necessary. I started packing his things. All of his clothes, his shoes, his personal items. I put everything neatly into bags and boxes. Each thing I put away symbolized a new phase of my life without him. When he came to his senses and realized what was happening, he didn't argue. Perhaps deep down he knew he deserved it. You don't know what you're doing. Mom was right, you're selfish, you only think of yourself, he uttered, his voice full of indignation and frustration. But even those words were nothing new. I kicked him out of the house. He went to his mother's house, and as I expected, she soon arrived to handle the situation. Asking her not to interfere was useless. She burst into the house with blazing eyes and an expression of extreme displeasure, which certainly only added tension to an already difficult situation. How could you do this to my son? She began, as if I was the one responsible for all the trouble. I tried to explain my position, but the woman was clearly not inclined to understand. He is my son, and he is obliged to take care of us and then your children. I raised him, I put all my soul, all my strength and love into him. And who are you to take him away from me? She screamed, completely ignoring the facts about our family. We'll take your children away from you. She threatened me, trying to pressure me. I realized that trying to explain anything was pointless. To her, these conversations were just a bunch of noise, and in the end, they had no effect whatsoever. Then I made a decision. I filed for divorce. This thought, long nurtured, became for me the only way out. I realized that I was morally ready for such a step. The divorce was long and painful. Every negotiation turned into endless arguments, and every document seemed to be a new stumbling block. Emotions raged, and even the smallest issues became an occasion for conflict. Time dragged slowly, but despite all the difficulties, the divorce was a kind of cleansing for me. I felt myself throwing off the shackles that were pulling me down. My family was confused, but knowing that I was moving forward gave me strength. Perhaps this was the path to a new beginning. Although I didn't know what lay ahead, I was ready. Ready for a change that would perhaps bring a new life, for me and for my children.